Did you hear that? Okay. Can I introduce? Oh, so this is us in B. Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna introduce the speakers. No, wait, the sponsors. It looks like in our room, Los Angeles B, the room sponsor is Max CDN, which is a content delivery network based here in LA. It says here the whole team is obsessed with speed, automation, real-time reports, and implementation. Probably network speed is what they mean. Although if they chose this room because there was an automotive talk today, maybe they care about like velocity as well. That would be interesting to know. Anyway, you can evidently get a free trial. If you have content you need to get out to people fast, visit maxcdn.com. That's pretty cool. A lot of sponsors don't give you free trials of things. Yeah. Well, there's sort of a soft start here because we've got about a minute or so. I was asking who in the audience had some sort of aftermarket homebrewed Linux or otherwise free software stuff running in your car, and there were like 5 or 6 hands, and you two in the front here both raised your hands. Can you tell us like roughly what you're doing?
I developed a program called Tram Tracker for parking lot trams.
Okay.
So it plays GPS announcements when you hit a waypoint.
Okay, waypoints would be in
Stop of a tram stop.
So by GPS coordinates?
By GPS coordinates and direction.
Okay.
So using the police radar module of GPS Drive, detecting speed traps.
Interesting.
Just modified the code so it would detect direction.
Well, that's certainly different.
Yeah.
What?
That's on your car or on your motorbike?
Yeah, you put it on your parking lot tram.
So it's a vehicle. It's just not a private vehicle, I guess would be the. Which is an interesting point because this comes up a lot. Like I talked about automotive stuff at GWADEC, which is a GNOME conference in Europe all the time, and not as many people drive their own cars there. But I had to point out, there's other vehicles that they all need software, and it's not just internal combustion engines that need software either. In fact, an electric vehicle probably needs more software, so it's just as big of an issue there. What was?
Not my project, but I have a Nissan Leaf, and somebody created Leaf Spy, which is a ODB dashboard type tool, and lets you see things that you can't normally.
Yeah, I've seen that too. Anybody else have something personal they wanted to tell us about in a sentence or less? Nelson? OBD GPS logger. The way it should be, one word. Were you raising your hand?
Yeah. We work on a open source project called Race Capture, Motorsport Lab, and it is a telemetry device for your race cars. Capture your driving and also capture your in real time.
Somebody write that down because I don't think that's in my slides here, but it should be. I tried to capture as much stuff as I can find, but as you'll see, that's one of the issues. It's all a lot of individual stuff that's scattered around. Anyway, we should get rolling. The official title for this talk is Hacking Your Car the Easy Way, so if that's what you're looking for, this is the right place. But now that everyone's here, I can tell you what the real title of the talk is. Just the same sentiments, but maybe not exactly what you would expect to see in a printed program. So that's a minor difference. If you don't know what that means, we will get to that. There's a first things first slide in a little bit, but just because it's conventional, this is as little personal information about myself as I can put on a slide. I work at LWN, which is a news site that just covers open source and Linux software, which means that my job is to write about the things that everybody else here does, which means if you stop doing those things, I will starve. So please don't do that. Also, email me if you have news about your project or something. You might think that everyone notices when there's a new release, but it's actually a lot more manual and difficult to find out about that stuff. So that's my email address, and there's a Twitter thing, and that's sort of a blog that I update about 4 times a year. And then the last thing there is Texas Linux Fest, which I have a bracelet for, which is a SCaLE-like conference that we have in Austin every year that I help organize. So you're all invited. It's not officially announced, but it's going to be in August. You've always wanted to visit Central Texas in August, so this is the time you can do that. But sorry, Austin is actually going to be, yeah. We've been in San Antonio once, but generally Austin is where most of the companies are, so it's just a good, convenient location. It's right in the middle of everything. Let's see. Up next, what you need to know about me. I'm what you would call an IVI enthusiast, IVI being in-vehicle infotainment, which means the stuff that distracts the driver from driving the car. The other big area there is engine control stuff, which is what kills the driver. But it's something that I've been sort of dabbling with for a couple of years because I went to conferences and heard about the projects and wanted to get more hands-on with that. For me personally, it's a little bit better fit than messing with the transmission and everything. I would also point out, though, that I'm not a millionaire, which means that I had to build the IVI stuff that I wanted to test myself. Like, there's some big companies like BMW and Toyota working on Linux-based vehicle stuff, but they're doing it for the cars that they're planning and building right now. So you won't see that on the showroom for a while. And if you want to do your own thing, that takes some time and some money of your own. But I also just wanted to write about it, so that meant I had to keep up with what was currently being developed. So anyway, back to first things first. The reason I was giving this talk is that a long, long time ago, in an era called SCaLE 12, I gave a talk about the IVI build that I had just completed, or I thought I had completed it. I kept working on it, and it was in my own car. This is an old photograph from that era of what the page looked like, and the slides back then were talking about me putting it into the Mustang and everything. And after the talk, somebody came up to me, and I described at some point like the rough cost that I had spent putting the system together. It's based on an Intel chip and very PC-like little ITX motherboard, and I said it was like $1,000 to $1,100 is what I'd spent. And somebody came up to me afterwards like, man, I felt so sorry to hear that. You should have used like a Panda board. It would have saved you so much money. I don't know who that was, so if you're here, I would love to give you credit for that. Apparently not. Anyway, the thing is, that's not entirely true, and I didn't really have a good answer at the time, but it made me think, well, a lot of the expenses that add up to that $1,100, they come in chunks that you can't get rid of just by changing the motherboard, like the SSDs, if you want to have your music with you, or OpenStreetMap, the world. That's going to take money, and you have to have Wi-Fi, and you have to have your GPS sensor and things like that, and those costs are kind of fixed. I also made the mistake of taking the radio out of my car to put the IVI thing in, which meant that I had to tie into the audio system. That takes money. And then the other big issue is that you don't have a lot of choices when it comes to the I/O stuff. Like, the screen space you have is pretty small. It's what fits into the dash, and there's like 2 companies that make screens for that, and you don't have a lot of great choices with keyboards and with touch support, and so you kind of are at the mercy of their pricing scheme there. And then the last thing is you have to do some wiring, and that's not a small task, and I roughly estimated as many words as would fit on there, but the thing is, the wiring comes in bits and pieces, and it's not cheap either. Like, the power cable running from the battery to where the amplifier is $8 a foot, and you could string it right from the engine compartment through the cabin, but you have to always get a little bit more, and that stuff adds up on you quickly. But that conversation did get me thinking about, well, there's certainly things I could have done differently that would have been cheaper, and maybe a talk about some of those options would be more useful for people. $1,000 is like building a brand new PC from the start if you have to get the case and the power supply and the monitor, everything like that you might have laying around. So here's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the Tizen thing that I built a little bit, just for background, and then we're going to talk about other things you could do to maybe lower the cost of getting into that. And then the other big option that you have these days, if you want to use free software, is to adapt an Android device into your car. That's pretty popular. It's a different approach in a lot of ways, particularly on the software front. We'll talk about that. And then I want to briefly discuss some single board computers that you can put into your car and that people are actually doing builds with, and then the Arduino an Arduino-like side of things, which you're not going to get a head unit that does much there, but your telemetry and data logging will be doable that way. And then finally, they'll probably end on why you should still care about this. Like, if the companies are still working on it, why do you want to do it yourself? And then maybe some open questions if I don't run out of time. So to not repeat everything that I said last year, the slides from that talk are online. The video is not. On the other hand, I went to LinuxConf Australia last month and gave a similar talk. It was updated for more recent work, and the video for that is online, but the slides are not. So you don't watch them together, but all the same information is in those two places about the details of the stuff that I put together. So I'm going to attempt to show it without doing all the details. This is the car. This is an hour after I bought it. It hasn't been that clean since. It's a 2005 Mustang GT. This is a picture of the sort of brains of units. You'll see there on the left is the amplifier I bought. It's the cheapest one I could find that had the right number of inputs. Then the black box on the right-hand side is a mini ITX case. And then there's a USB sound card down there, and then there's the ATX-style power supply. Not all the wires are hooked up, which is why it looks clean there.
How many watts is the power supply?
More than I need. It's like 200, something like that. I forget. Not that you have a lot of choices. Anyway, so that's like the glamour shot. In reality, most of the time it looks like this, which is to say I take it in and out of the car a lot. It's mounted on a board that fits into the trunk. That's not necessarily the ideal way to do it. Remember how I mentioned the wires? The diagram on the bottom there is sort of the cables that I've had to run, and the battery is the red block, and I had to run power back to the power supply, and also I ran separate power to the amplifier, and then I actually had to run 12-volt power from that back to the front of the car to hook the monitor up, and then of course I had to run a USB cable to the monitor to get touchscreen support, and that takes a lot of your time, and you get a lot of little scrapes on your hands doing that side of the project. But just a list here. I decided to make something really PC-like because I'm familiar with PCs and not with ARM development. So the main components there, M4ATX is the name of that power supply. It listens for, it has a separate input for ignition sense, and when it senses that the key has been turned, then it supplies power to the motherboard. It replaces the power switch button. I have a Bluetooth OBD adapter like this, made by SCaLE. They're like $89 for the Bluetooth version. You can get a cheaper one. That's the first thing you can do to cheapen things is you can get the one that's USB instead. It's like $49. But then you also have another USB cable to run. So there's the trade-off there. And when I say a bunch of USB stuff, I think I have 13 devices because I have the touchscreen, and then I have a little RF keyboard thing, and then I have the GPS unit, and then I have the sound card, and there's a hub because it wasn't all in the right place. So that's sort of the problem of 1,000 tiny hammers chipping away at your wallet. The interesting thing to think about when I thought about how could you do this cheaper, a lot has changed in the Tizen project since 14 months ago when I started this. For starters, they've switched over to this new 3.0 code base, which has a different web runtime, and a whole different application stack in some ways. Lots of newer stuff, but they used to just make builds, and these are installable disk images. Sorry, not installable. They're just disk images. You raw copy them onto, your drive, and they used to just make them for this developer hardware that you couldn't even buy unless you were a company. I actually was at the Automotive Linux Summit, and the maker of this thing was there, and I was like, so if I wanted to get one, and they're like, yeah, I don't know who you'd ask about that. They mean well, but that's just not the business they're in, right? So they have started in the past 6 months making these Tizen IVI releases for the Intel NUC, which is this thing. It is a lot smaller, and it comes with most of the stuff that I mentioned I had to add separately. It's got sound. It's not going to be the best sound ever, but Wi-Fi built in, and you don't need a separate processor. You don't need to buy RAM. You can buy RAM. So that's a lot more convenient, and it's smaller, and you can probably even find a better place to put it. And then there's the Miniboard Max, which is That is an Intel-based device as well. I've got a picture of that since I don't physically have one. It's like the second generation of the Minoboard module. Technically it's an SBC, but it's kind of cool that they're making a Tizen release for this. The thing maybe to note there is that probably the magic choice that I didn't intentionally make is that all of the things that they make these releases for use Intel graphics chips, which is pretty important. Intel is one of the main people working on Tizen, and you know that's probably why it works so well. If you chose something that has NVIDIA graphics built in, you might not have as much fun. So it's actually easier to get started with Tizen IVI than it was a year and a half ago when I first started thinking about this, because you have a couple additional choices that are maybe a little cheaper and a little bit less complex. The thing that you need to realize, though, is that I chose Tizen because I wanted to follow the development of the automotive-specific stuff. But if all you want is some specific apps, like to have your music collection and to run Navit, which is the open-source navigation engine, you can basically use any Linux distro to do that. You have the same hardware issues as far as you need to power the thing from the battery and get that right. But you don't have to use Tizen just because I did. The interesting thing about it, though, is that when you install Tizen, you get this initially, which doesn't look like a lot, but that's a Wayland desktop, and that's sort of the point, is that Tizen is a consumer electronics platform that has a real Linux distribution underneath it. It's not Android libraries that have a totally different API than you use. So you have regular developer tools like GCC and Git.
It's a clean interface.
It is, yeah. This is the demo UI that they make for Tizen. You'll notice it's portrait orientation. And when I said you have only a few choices for monitors, they're all landscape orientation. So you get to grapple with that. Mine, you can actually scroll up and down a little bit. So it works okay. In any case, if you don't really have an opinion on what Linux distribution you might use, I would recommend you give Ubuntu a look. There's a couple of specific reasons for that. One is that touch support actually works, which I unfortunately can't say for every distro these days. And the other, which is probably more future-looking, is that Genevi does a lot of development on Ubuntu, and it seems like a lot of the people who are working on these automotive software projects seem to use that as their platform of choice. The Tizen SDK comes out for Ubuntu. It's, you know, a convenience issue for you, but don't spend too much time on it. The other thing to realize is that your automotive computer project is not going to be the same as your neighbor's, including me. I'm your neighbor, because what you prioritize is going to vary a lot. The big ones for the majority of users: navigation, having access to audio like radio and maybe some services, and then data logging and noticing what your engine is doing and that kind of thing. Which of those is most important depends on how you drive. I don't care about navigation a lot because I live in a town of like 120,000 people, and I've lived there for ages, and I know my way around. I don't get lost. I don't travel out into the sticks on business, so the navigation is not as important to me. It may be the main thing you do. If you're a real estate agent, I know you care a lot about that because you have to go all over town at any given moment. Okay, so down to the nitty-gritty. What are things that I could have done to make a Tizen-like build cheaper? One is that power supply that I mentioned. I got a bigger power supply than I need because I was not sure how much stuff I was going to have to tie into it. You have some other choices there. The other main thing I would note is that you don't have to pull the audio system out of your car, which I did as well. And a lot of people get around this by tying directly into the auxiliary input of their existing car stereo unit, and that's not hard to do. They sell things that cost like $75 to do this, and you don't really need to pay that much because it's just wires. It's just a pair of wires with audio in, and you can get the pin out for your car stereo unit by looking around the internet and sites like MP3 Car. And I'm adding on the bottom of that list there are other displays you can use. You don't have to have something that fits into the dash and looks really nice. So you can go with a cheaper display if you want to, and I mean cheaper in the sense of $30 as opposed to $250. So let's look at a couple of the power things. You can get a direct DC to DC power supply like this. The thing that's nicer, that's like $35, I think. And it's made by the same company that makes the one that I got that fits into an ATX case and has an ATX adapter. It's not going to plug right into an ATX motherboard, of course, but the other thing is that you don't necessarily get the nicety of the thing that waits for ignition sense and then has a little delay to make sure you didn't forget something and go back inside and turn the car off. You could probably get away with trying to have the car start up immediately as soon as it gets ignition sense power. You can tap into the ignition sense wire yourself if you have the wiring manual, but you're going to run a little bit, you're going to have a little bit iffy over time shutting down. But that's something you should think about. It's not necessary to spend money on the big power supply. The same people also make sort of a UPS module, and there's several manufacturers of these. These things are originally designed, I think, for people doing projects that have solar power and battery power, and it switches between one or the other depending on whether there is power coming in over the non-battery input. They're not necessarily that cheap. That's $50 or so, but you could use, if you have like a smaller box like the NUC that's designed to have a DC wall wart power supply, that's probably a simpler solution to tie it into that. On the audio front, like I mentioned, a lot of car stereos these days have a CD changer port, and if you want to, you can just go get one that does, because they're not expensive. The cable for that sort of thing is pretty simple. That's like $8, Amazon and eBay. There's no need to buy an amplifier and to replace your car stereo unit. If you don't listen to CDs very much anymore, which most of us don't, you're not going to miss the CD changer. So you can save a good, $150 going that route. The other option to consider, though, again, if you don't want cables, this is also like $8, and it's a Bluetooth adapter, and you may find it easier to pair your IVI unit to a Bluetooth. I think that thing presents itself as there's a Bluetooth speaker profile, I think, so that's probably what it does. You may get a cheaper one that mimics being a headset. As far as your computer is concerned, it's just playing audio either way. This is a picture of the display. So mine's made by Xenarc. I got what's a slightly pricier model because it's a little bit higher resolution. They're basically all like 480 by 800 DVD resolution. That one's a little better. It's not HD resolution. I think these things were originally made for people doing video, and it's a monitor to see what's being recorded on your video camera. But you don't have to go with one of those. There is a big market these days for cheaper screens that are used for backup cameras and things, and that's $35. You'll note it has RCA video input. Is that going to matter? Probably not if you're going 5 feet. If you're going 15 feet and it has to go around something really noisy electrically in a car, you might have signal degradation there, but that's certainly a cheaper way to get started. The other thing I think is interesting, which I have definitely not tried, is these, which are the rear view mirror replacements that are designed to tie into a camera. I would love to see someone actually try this and have that be like their main display. That one's in the center, so that's probably not ideal, but there's others where the display part shows up on the side of the mirror, and you would need a really dark theme for the UI, but if it's just going to show you messages as they happen, I think that would be interesting, kind of a stealth way. When the car is turned off, people who are there to steal stuff are not going to see that you have an IVI system in your car. But let's move on and talk about Android. There's hardware and software issues to using Android as your IVI head units. First of all, you still have to do a lot of physical integration work if you don't want it to look terrible. You still have to worry about power, and it's some of the same issues in that the battery, you can't just tie directly into the battery of the car for a variety of reasons. And then audio is not as simple on an Android tablet as you think it's going to be. And in addition to that, you may not have a bunch, you may not have 13 USB ports. So first of all, physical integration, this is actually from somebody's build log. That's not even a build, right? It's just like stuck into a stick there. So you can go from that all the way up to having something really nice fabricated that's a Nexus 7 tablet in that. So it just depends on you how much work you want to do there. You don't necessarily have to start out there. You can start out there and then integrate it later. But it's a consideration when you're building, and that's going to cost you something if you want to integrate it nicely like that. Lithium-ion batteries are what come in most of your tablet-style devices, and the car battery is not designed to work the same way as one of those. So this is probably the only thing that borders on being you can destroy stuff this way. The issue is that there's other things that take priority off the car battery, like the alternator. If you don't have the alternator working, it's not really a car, right? So whatever voltage you may measure with your multimeter off the battery, when you crank the alternator, it drops down considerably. And there was a talk yesterday in the embedded track about USB not working right when you plug things in the wrong order. Well, you can experience that and probably damage some things if the voltage drops, from 12 volts down to 3 and then back up to 15. So you got to watch out for that. Several approaches. Don't just get like a cheap step-down converter and hope that'll be fine. You need to think about that. I've seen people take several approaches to doing this. One, there are like specialty voltage converters designed to do this, and they're not just the way that they have a resistor stuck across it to absorb the extra power, because the car battery at best 12 volts, you probably need like 3.3 or 5 volts. An example of that, they look like this. It's a bigger block. You can see it has yellow wire on one side, which means 12 volts, and red on the other, which means 5. Although I think in that one is actually reversed. But the point is, this is an inexpensive thing you can get off of eBay. The other option is they make these that are designed to be phone chargers in cars as well. And again, it's how much you want to spend on this sort of thing, but you can, you wire, let's see, back up to the actual talk there. You want to wire into the accessory line generally, which is what's on when the car is started up and the interior lights in the radio system is working there. So that's the first two examples here are the ones I showed pictures of, which is an off-the-shelf USB charger device. You can kind of rig that up, or you can get the thing that's designed to be wired in directly. I've actually found some people who custom-made something out of a SparkFun breakout board. I don't know that that saves you a lot of time significantly, but again, in all of these solutions, what people end up doing is sort of abusing the charge cycle of the device. For example, the car turns on, that sends power to the device, which has its own charging circuit and thinks it's charging from the wall connector or something. And then when the car turns off, you can have a script that turns the screen off, so it's using a trickle of power off of its own internal battery. But how long that lasts, not guaranteed. And how long you can actually live off of the charging cycle in the car is not guaranteed either. I have one of these devices that plugs right into the cigarette lighter, and this is the 2 amp version. And one of my tablets, when it gets down below 10% battery and the GPS is on and everything, it's not enough trickle power coming through that to keep it alive and charge it at the same time. So it'll shut down and charge because that's what the circuit tells it to do. So it's a risky endeavor, I think. As far as the audio, USB audio on an Android tablet is not great. It's designed for headphones, which means you have to amplify it if you want to get it into the car audio system, and it's also probably not clean. So what most people do who build a system of their own is get a USB DAC, which is a nice sound card. I had one in that picture I showed of the trunk that cost like $25, $30. And yeah, again, with the audio, you have sort of the same questions that we already covered in the Tizen cheapo section, which is that the easiest thing to do if you have an extra import is to link directly into that. But you would be surprised how terrible the audio sounds if you just take the headphone out port and wire that directly, and even if you have an amplifier in between, because it's noisy and not designed to be amplified that much. Speaking of USB, your tablet will have to be USB host capable or USB on the go in order to connect peripheral devices to it. Your other option there is make sure you get a really expensive tablet that has as many sensors as you can find built into it, which again is not a problem to find those. The Nexus tablets are like that, but it's a cost consideration. That moves on to the software question. The first thing I would note on the software angle is that people who do this sort of customizing their Android tablet for use in the car tend to belong to like the XDA developer community, and they're really obsessed with ROMs as the distribution, which means they build an image that installs directly onto your device and boots from that. And as somebody who comes from the Linux era where you have packages and you can actually choose things and you install it, I don't necessarily trust a ROM that's in a zip file on download.com or someplace as much. But this is what they're doing. You can't persuade people who build these projects that there's a better way to do it. So you take what they give you or you go your own way. There are two that seem pretty popular as far as car builders go. The first one is called USB-ROM, and it's got its own power logic so that when external power support is plugged in, it's used to, it goes into host mode and powers USB host devices, and when the external power goes away, then it switches the host mode off, and then it just lives off its own power as long as it can. AutoDroid, I think, is much the same thing. It's a few different settings and so on that are tweaked there, and also it seems to be updated only rarely, so I don't know if you should depend on that. USB-ROM is pretty active. People use that for a variety of sort of alternative Android tablet projects. The other thing maybe you should note is that almost all of these are designed for Nexus devices like this, because you have to be able to get to the bootloader to modify them in this way. And Nexus devices are great, but they're also not the cheapest. I've seen like one good build that's based on a Barnes & Noble Nook, which is sort of the low end of the tablet. I think I've got a link to that later on, but you're sort of limited in your choices if you want to go that route. As far as the App Store goes, there are dozens, actually I counted more than 100 free of charge OBD diagnostic apps that will work with this thing that I showed you earlier. It plugs into the diagnostic port. There's more than 100 of those on the Google Play Store, but they're proprietary for the most part. I spent at least, I don't know, probably since Australia, so like 3 weeks or so, trying to find links to as many actual open source automotive themed Android apps as I could, and I came up with a dozen, which is, you know, probably more than you'll use in any one day. So here's the first list of those. The first one, CarCast, is a podcasting client, so it's not really that automotive focused. Car Report and Fill Up are both for logging fuel consumption. So when you fill up your car, you log you bought, how much you bought, and what you paid for it maybe. CarBus Interface is actually a utility that lets you bind Android events to button presses on the steering wheel control, assuming that your car has steering wheel buttons that use CAN bus signals, CAN bus being the automotive bus that all these legacy devices are going to use. HUD is sort of a single purpose thing. That's the last one down there. And it's a GPS-based speedometer that's designed to reflect into the windshield, so you have the tablet jammed onto the far as forward as you can put it in the windshield so that you can see it light up, which means you either have a second tablet or you're not looking at the map on the tablet. Second page here, Navit and Osmand, which I don't know, that's how they want it pronounced. Those are both navigation. I've used both of those. Navit's a little more mature, but Navit's kind of weird if you're not using the same stack that they expect. Osmand, it's a little bit tricky because there's so much data on OpenStreetMap, and it seems to want to default show you every point of interest on the map, and it's kind of cluttered. You can fix that, I'm sure. Purple Dock is a home screen. It is purple, but it's designed to be sort of an automatic, quick access to your main functionality. Track Car I put up there. It's actually a GPS logger. Despite having the word car in the title, it's not car specific. But if you want to do, logging your trips for studying your fuel consumption, it can be useful. Speed of Sound is something that adjusts the music volume based on car speed, which is interesting. Again, more of a utility. If you are looking for just a music player, your standard Android music player options are what you have to go with there. So you don't really need special work for that. I feel like I forgot one. Oh, OBD2 Reader. There is, like you would expect, it just shows you a little heads-up display of whatever comes in from your OBD connector. There's one other, which is supposedly free software by this group called, and I didn't put it on there, forget the name of it. Well, it's announced here, and they later had a website that they launched with one of those scrolling. Yes?
OBD GPS logger cars is also posted.
Okay, great. OBD GPS logger source. Yeah. Yeah, most of the apps that I've found are available through F-Droid, which is the free software Android app store. That doesn't mean that's everything. I've also done what I can to search through GitHub and other places like that. But yeah, there's always going to be separate things that are announced somewhere unrelated. So we can certainly add more to that list. As far as build logs go, I just put a handful up here to sort of demonstrate. These are the ones that I think are high quality in terms of taking you through the whole process. You'll also note the first three cover the main places where you're going to find build logs, like Instructables and the XDA forum and MP3 Car, which is a community of people building head units. And the last one down there is some guy's site that he set up by himself about his BMW. I think the final thoughts I would say on using Android is bear in mind you're buying into the Android ecosystem, and if you're not an Android developer, it may not be as much fun as being a Linux developer is. And also don't forget that you have to buy the actual tablet to do this. So if we're looking at a cost savings angle, the Nexus tablets aren't the cheapest. And then again, you still have some of the same issues as far as you know, you need to have sensors if you want to use sensor data and log sensor data, and you have USB items. If you have USB host, you can have a hub. Yes?
There's also the BeagleBone Android port.
Okay, yeah, true, yeah. And technically, there's also Android x86, which I think you could probably get somewhere with. Yeah. True. Yeah, native apps are not going to run on Android x86. Anyway, moving on. Speaking of the BeagleBoard, excellent transition. Why does it have to be a full-fledged motherboard? It doesn't. So there's a lot of SBCs on the market today that are designed to run Linux to one degree or another. The thing is, these do have their limits, and your neighbor has limits as well. Specifically, touchscreen support may be an issue for you. You can definitely save money getting a $35 Raspberry Pi as opposed to a $200 ITX system like I built. You still have to worry about power consumption. In this case, the power consumption story is a little different because there's only so many devices you can chain off of, you know, a BeagleBone before it's taxing its power supply too much. I know you can go the route of adding powered hubs and things, but that adds some complexity that might be tricky to debug. The other thing to realize with a single board computer, and this is true of every like Raspberry Pi project, you're like, it's $35 and I can build a home security system. Well, you do have to buy a lot of capes and things to stack onto it, and those can add up. If you do want GPS and audio, that's not garbage audio, that means a DAC. There are some good high quality Raspberry Pi audio boards, but those are going to add cost to you as well. The good news is that because the maker community is so big with these, that Linux support is pretty good, and you can get a fairly usable experience without doing a lot of custom work. To get to the specifics, the original MinoBoard, not the MinoBoard Max, already had CAN input-output pins on it. I think that the Max does not, or if it does, they're just not talking about it. CAN, again, is the vehicle bus. You can probably, you can tap into the CAN bus with one of these devices, but in my car, when I pull the radio out, there's also a CAN bus wire pair in the radio header because it needs to know certain things, like are the headlights on, that sort of thing. So it's a bus. You can add yourself to the bus. You don't have to get permission and remove something to add something new to the bus. The BeagleBone, I think both generations of that, is David Anders here? He's not. I believe both versions of that, you can get a CAN interface, but it's not, there aren't pins for it on the headers on the board. So there is that cape by Circuit Code designed to give you access to those. Interestingly enough, the Banana Pi, which is one of those aftermarket Raspberry Pi clones, also has CAN bus pins on it. So you can tap into that and read messages. Are you asking a question? Yes? It's going to be kind of vehicle specific, but generally speaking, yeah, I mean, it's not. It's the vehicle specific stuff that's the issue there. Actually being able to find libraries to read it is not that tough. It stands for Control Area Network, and it's an industrial bus that is Ethernet-like, but a lot simpler, and originally it was a lot slower because it's sort of old, but it's just how one device sends a message to another that says, we're now in 5th gear, or, yes?
2008 forward, before that it was.
Your airbags are generally connected to it, so you want to be careful.
That's a good question, and the other talks that I've given have delved into that more, and there are obviously people who know a lot more about it than me, but the adapter that I showed plugs into the diagnostic port. It can get CAN bus messages. There's 2 sets of them on my car, but it also gets other kinds of diagnostic codes. So like the engine control unit will send warnings that are meant to be read by a shop, and the SCaLE people, their app, which is free to use but not open source, can read those. But yeah, the raw CAN bus messages they're not encrypted, there's no authentication, they're just sort of, you need the library to decode them, and it's up to you what you want to do with it. Tizen is built to support this, and you can log messages that way. Yeah, it's just sort of, I wouldn't fixate too much on it, particularly if you're more interested in the IVI navigation head unit stuff, but it's sort of what you need to know in order to get the vehicle side of your vehicle computer working.
What percentage of the market actually uses this? Is it like all brands except Chevy or?
Allison, you have an idea what that would? What percentage of car makers are using CAN bus versus something else?
So the older cars starting in 2006 all had CAN. There's multiple CAN buses. If you look at the connector by your steering wheel, you count the number of pins, you can see how many buses there are. The CAN tools that you get that are cheap only support OBD2, which is the smog check. If you want to read the LIN bus, which controls the door locks and things like that, if you want to unlock your door, if you want to control the AC, you have to get on these other buses, and then you have to buy more expensive scan tools. Best resources are mp3car.com that they've already showed, and scantool.net. And on mp3car.com, there's reverse engineered codes for a lot of cars. But if you are on the bus that can control the windows and the heating and so forth, you can also brick your car.
Yeah, brick in more than one sense, actually. Yeah. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer. The thing is that car makers, like the bus, is just a network layer, so car makers can sort of do what they want as far as their packet formats goes. So
Pretty much everybody uses CAN.
pretty much.
Some form or other.
Here.
There's a lot of variation in the tool.
The newest cars are having firewalls with packet filtering, and they're going to another technology called Ethernet ADB, and also FlexRay. And so if you get a brand new car, a lot of it may not be accessible because of the firewalls, and then there's addition that the other network standards like FlexRay or Ethernet ADB will come in. So that's a whole other story.
Okay.
Yes.
I believe the CAN bus itself, not the protocol underlying, well, like, the basic the basic frame, that's standardized.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think the CAN bus itself is like some kind of standard that you have to have if you're selling a car in the United States.
Yeah, I know that that's true in general. I'm just not up to date on what the specifics for. I mean, there's some layers above CAN bus that are standardized, but standardized doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Another good thing you can do is check out the developer programs of your car makers, and a lot of them have those these days. Ford's happens to be really open in that they publish documentation for everything, which you don't have to sign an NDA to see. Others are not as nice there.
GM have one?
GM has one, yeah. I don't have a GM car, so I didn't bother signing up for it, but And that's sort of the other trick, is as much information as you'll find in MP3 car, which is a community centered around the car computing angle, you'll find just as much going to the car community centered around your car, at least if you have a car that's popular for being itself, like the Mustang is. A minivan may not have a community dedicated to it, but you'd probably then find like a Chevy forum or something where a lot of people will talk about the modifications and stuff they do. A lot of that's going to be centered on people doing their own entertainment systems, like audio, but these days it's just more and more including computing stuff because it's possible to do, which it wasn't, 20 years ago. Let's see, is there anything else you want to say to that? Yeah, okay, so just to cover, like, Raspberry Pi, like you'd expect, a lot of people have done things to adapt the Raspberry Pi, for use in the car, just because it's so cheap. There is one you can get CAN access through SPI. I think the first of those, well, it's actually the next to last link down there, is a really good build log where somebody is describing how they did this, sort of eating into where you might see more Raspberry Pi specific shields, are the fact that you can adapt an Arduino shield to use on the Raspberry Pi, and that's just as good. The bottom URL down there is another really good build log, but believe me, the URL is so long I couldn't put it on the screen without anyone being able to, with anyone being able to read it. So I made that short link yesterday. It should still work for a while. And I think that one is one of the ones that starts with an Arduino shield. In addition to what's built in, you'll see there are several CAN-capable capes for the BeagleBones. And did I mention on that? Yeah, that is one. The PiCAN is one that's specific to the Raspberry Pi. I had something else I was going to say about that. It's probably on the next slide. Well, we'll get around to it. Again, I wanted to say that the expansion board issue is not, if you want data access, you'll want to get one of the CAN board things to listen in, but don't forget that you are going to use up pins for other things. So if that's not your first concern, like logging CAN bus messages about what the oil pressure is and whatever else, then you may not want to start there. You may want to start getting your GPS working and then getting 3G connectivity, and all those things add up to more power that you consume and more I/O pins that you use. Then again, like I mentioned, the Arduino is even more popular than the Raspberry Pi, so do you really need to use your Pi for this? What you want to do is log data where you've been, speed and altitude, and whatever messages you can get off of the CAN bus on your car, like as far as engine speed and fuel consumption. You may just be happier using an Arduino itself. There's a lot of those. I just stopped writing down the number of Arduino shields that I found that are designed for CAN or OBD access. They're not complicated, so there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of varying price points. The thing is, availability varies too. If it's a personal project by some people, they may run out and not decide to make any more for a year. There are also a few things that are like full-on kits that are designed to be deployed as a data monitoring system. I think the second one down there comes with an LCD screen, and the first one may or may not, I forget. The first one, ArduinoDev.com, their store has done like 3 revisions of Arduino shields designed to do vehicle data logging, and that's the cheapest one. I think it was $60. Somebody who has web access can tell us maybe, but they've had more expensive ones in the past. So you've got some choices there. Probably the bigger issue there. Here's what I was going to mention. Yeah. So basically, all of the shields that you see for accessing CAN bus information have the same chips on them, and it's not going to be drastically different from one to the next, assuming that it's your price point and they'll ship it to you. Like SparkFun, I think, has published a library for accessing, for reading information from their SCaLE, and I think a lot of other people have just adapted that, or they've written their own, and it's not terribly complicated. Probably the more difficult thing to find than the actual devices and the libraries is good build log style information. Here, the leading candidate by far is this guy named John Oxer, lives in Australia, and back in 2009, which is ancient history as far as a lot of these kinds of projects go, he gave this talk called Geek My Ride, and it was about, he had a single board computer that was like given to him somehow, and he mounted it in the trunk and did all kinds of data logging stuff from there, and he kept going and added an RFID tag reader, and he has an RFID tag implanted in his hand. He's a very normal person. This surprises me. He's regular, does not dress like a steampunk person or something like that. He also wrote this book, Practical Arduino, which has a lot of like hands-on projects, including his vehicle telemetry work. And so that's an excellent, it's clearly the easiest guide to follow on this topic. And the software that goes along with it is on that bottom link there at Google Code. When did people stop using Google Code? It wasn't that long ago. But yeah, that tells you it was not this year because it would be on GitHub if it was this year. Some other build logs. The second one there in particular is about racing. So I don't know if I happen to capture your racing stuff in there or not, but that'll be where it belongs. I've met some other people when I gave this sort of talk about my own build when I was in Australia for a LinuxConf there. Met John Oxer, met some other people who do their own like auto racing stuff and need telemetry because that's how you compete and win. So yeah, there's several good build logs there that I would start with. Again, the thing to note is your car is not your neighbor's car. What you want to do with it is not going to be the same as what your neighbor wants to do with it. So you always have to adapt from there. Sort of the last front of microcontrollers are these things that don't fit into other categories. And I mentioned the Ford developer program. They have two. One's their official developer program, and one's called OpenXC, which they want to make into a standard. And this is an OpenXC dongle. On the inside, it's got a microcontroller from the same family as the Arduino. You can actually make your own. There's schematics and firmware source for these available, and I think they collaborated with Bug Labs to make the first ones. It's a CAN to JSON event translation system. This is perhaps why it hasn't taken the world by storm. It's a nice idea. They want to have a little open standard about this, but is it really that much easier to use? I don't think so. Nonetheless, those of us who own Fords got a lot of free information out of this, and I like the fact that they're trying, even if it's sort of an odd thing to try. Yeah, and it does have the benefit of being entirely open source. And as far as I can tell, open hardware, yes? Oh, Chrysler does. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Ford has been, they have several people in the World Wide Web Consortium's vehicle group, and I know they want other people to adopt it. So if Chrysler is actually supporting it too, that's actually big news. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to bring up, this is brand new, and I have high hopes for this. This is the CAN bus triple. What you're looking at there, the bright orange brick, is the prototype. This guy, I think in Detroit actually, is where he lives, made prototypes, like 50 or 100 of those, and sold them, and then did a Kickstarter. And the Kickstarter wrapped up, and I supported it, and mine just arrived on Wednesday. So I haven't even plugged in and tested it. And yeah, it's actually nicer than the prototype. It's got an aluminum case. So, but yeah, this is also open hardware, and I know for a fact it's open hardware because all of the design files and the PCB files and schematics and everything is available on the site already, canb.us, or actually I think it's docs.canb.us. It has 3 of those CAN transceiver chips that I mentioned that everyone uses. They're not expensive, so that's not a big expense on his part. It also has a Bluetooth low energy adapter and a USB serial port, which means it can do a lot more stuff than most of the single adapters can. For example, it can man in the middle. It can alter CAN bus messages and inject things to them if you want to do that. I don't recommend you send commands to the engine, but I mean, if you're a racing person, you might need to do that. This is a sort of block diagram of how it works. As you can see, it's got a microcontroller in it that happens to also be supported by the Arduino IDE. And then it has 3 separate CAN buses. My car has 2. There's one that's the high-speed bus for the engine and important stats, and there's one that's for the radio and what position the seat is in and stuff like that. So I can listen to both of those, and I could add a 3rd channel of other devices. I actually looked into this. The thing is, there's not a lot of like aftermarket CAN devices. There's a couple of radar detectors that I found and a couple of alarms. The thing is, all the ones that are high-end enough to allow you to control them with CAN bus also support like Ethernet and USB. So is it really worth it? In my opinion, no. But I do know that the UAV people who build like Linux-based drones have decided to work on a CAN bus powered module for their sensors. So maybe that'll come in handy. It's nice to have the option anyway. Yeah, like I said, Arduino IDE supports. He's started putting firmware up. I haven't actually gotten to play with it yet, but the firmware for the beta units has already been posted, and he's got some newer variations with a couple different options. And yeah, it is really cool that it's open hardware as well as software, so I have high hopes for that. I wanted to end the discussion of hardware things with the question, well, do you really need a microcontroller anyway? You can go really old school and just play with reading voltages and bit banging wires and things. When I pulled the radio unit out of my car, I got the adapter for like $7 from O'Reilly, not the tech publisher, but the auto parts place. And it has a little pinout showing all the things that you can just tell by reading whether there's voltage or not on a wire. And it's more than I thought. Like, there's a night mode, day mode wire in my car, which is just telling you whether the headlights are on. Hopefully they're on if it's night, right? Do you need to monitor CAN bus to know if the headlights have been turned on? No, you can actually just read that right off of a wire there. Similarly, you can tell if you're in reverse. That's how your backup camera knows to activate, is there's a separate wire that just goes hot if it's in reverse. So there's some things you can do that you don't even need a computer for. Worth pointing out, though, you do probably need to add the manual and the wiring diagrams from your car. Those are the ones, I got those on eBay. They're not supposed to sell them. They come from garages that close down and stuff. And I know you don't have a good sense of scale for that, but that black thing on top there is the case for a computer. It's, you know, like this. So these are not small books. You will probably need to leave some room in the trunk to carry those around. The other thing that is really important about doing this is, I don't know if anybody noticed this. I think it's hilarious, but the very first slide I had was like 0th, and then the one right after that was epsilon, which is an obscure math joke about surreal numbers. And epsilon is a number that's bigger than 0, but smaller than all the real numbers, right? It's a different way of defining numbers. It's just crazy that if you use this guy's way of defining numbers, the operations and things still work. Well, there is no math system in which 12 volts is the same as 3.3. So if you're going to read your GPIO line on an Arduino or something, you have to convert your nominally 12 volt automotive signal into something. There's more than one way to do this. The electrical engineers will give you more details on this. I'm not one of those. I will say that the linear regulator is the cheap caveman way to do it, which is it just sort of dissipates the extra voltage as heat. If you live in Southern California, you don't need extra heat in your car. I live in Texas, I don't need extra heat in my car. So what you want there is a switch mode power supply or a buck converter. I'm actually not clear if those are the same thing or not, but they're not hard to come by either. That's the last little thing I was going to show there is one that I got off of eBay, which comes with a heatsink in case I do need it. And you just plug in and out, in on one side, out on the other, and you can then read that line at 3.3 volts if you want.
What is that you have
This is a step-down voltage converter that I got off of eBay for like $1.80, and I could have gotten several more cheaper if I had ordered them in bulk. But I wanted to include that to say that you don't have to be super high tech to get involved in this, and it's worth exploring what you can do with simple tools like Arduino before you decide to invest in something bigger like the Raspberry Pi or the Android.
Okay, if your signaling voltage is 0 or 12 nominal, what's the actual voltage when it is nominally 0?
It depends. I don't know. I don't know if I've got a good real world answer for you there. When I've tested it in my own car, I got like 0.1 or something off of the I was specifically testing the headlights are on or off wire, and it was, you know, it was vanishingly small anyway. Are you thinking there's a safety issue there, or just a code, how do you read it issue?
Basically for 0 versus non-0 with maybe a series resistor or something for protection.
Yeah, again, an electrical engineer is who needs to answer that question, not a tech journalist. But I mean, and I'm a software journalist. I'm not an electronic engineer journalist. But if the currents are low, you can use voltage dividers.
If they're not low, then you'll burn stuff.
How much current does your battery put out? That's going to vary battery to battery.
Yes, you can use resistors.
Yeah. Anyway, I am going to have to play with this more. I just got, again off of eBay, a steering wheel from a newer Mustang that has more buttons on it that I need to wire into my computer and read somehow. So I'm going to be dividing voltages and then reading signals for those button presses. That's the volume keys, which otherwise I wouldn't have volume keys, so that's pretty important. Finally, why do you care about this? Your car is the second most expensive thing you own, probably, unless you own a boat. In which case, you probably have software on your boat too. You probably have mapping issues and connectivity issues there. Also, a lot of huge companies are investing their resources and money in automotive Linux things, but they're several years away for most of us from seeing those. If you're not a millionaire, you don't buy a new car just to see what the software is like. And when I say big companies, sorry?
If you think the power is dirty on a car.
Yes, everything is dirtier on a boat. That's true. And when I say big companies, you may think Google is big. Toyota had like $1 trillion in revenue last year. So this is big stuff, and it's not going to come to the aftermarket first. So you have to go out and seek it. But I think it's important that we do that. I wanted to end with some open questions. Don't really have time. One of those things is that networking still coming together. As far as I know, the W3C would like to have some standards for accessing vehicle information, waypoints, and stuff like that. And I'd like to know what everyone else thinks about where we should collect resources on this sort of thing. We could abuse the eLinux wiki, but we could maybe find other places that are better to make some of this information accessible. That's really all the time I have. Sorry I went a little bit long there, but thank you for sticking around. Those are all open source fonts by a friend of mine named Vernon Adams, who lives somewhere out here.